Rembrandt, self-portrait, Amsterdam, 1658. Van Gogh, self-portrait, Arles, 1889. Picasso, self-portrait, Paris, 1907. Ashley Bickerton, self-portrait, New York, 1989. The artist, the place, and the time. How much does an artist draw from his time, from the past, from his surroundings, from his peers? The answers are varied and complex. The questions burn brightly every 2 years in New York in an exhibition called the Whitney Biennial. If we expect the biennial to hold up a mirror to our passions and concerns, it may be useful to remember how it all began. The first Whitney Biennial reflected a calm and ordered society, which took delight in pleasant still lifes, serene landscapes, and decorous nudes. There were flashes of vitality, echoing or departing from the styles of European modernism, and a cruelly effective bit of social satire. But only a few works evoked, in their bleak and melancholy stillness, the devastating reality of the time.
For the American artist, 1932 was a desperate time. By the end of 1931, there were already 8 million unemployed in the Great Depression, the worst depression this country had ever known. By the end of the year, about 1/3 of the working force was unemployed, and artists were particularly hard hit. New York was devastated by the Great Depression, and about half of American artists lived in the New York area. The artist found himself almost overnight cut off from sources of patronage. Some left the field of art altogether, turned toward other occupations. Others were reduced literally to begging in the street for food. And that could not help but be reflected in their art, in the art at least of some of the painters, particularly of the social realists who emerged in the years of the Great Depression.
If the Depression found a voice in social realism, what art can speak for a time of angst and affluence?
The last body of work that I produced in 1988 was a body of work based on banality. If you really focus and look at the heart or the core of my work and my relationship and my negotiations between the animate and the inanimate, it comes from Eastern philosophy. In the past, artists were great liberators. This has really changed. People that are in control and are the great seducers, the manipulators, the propagandists now are in other industries. They've gone into advertising, they've gone into the film industry, and they've gone into popular culture. The liberation that exists in popular culture has to be returned to the art world. For art to be potent again, we must manipulate. We must accept the responsibility to exploit the masses. We have to exploit ourselves first, but then we must exploit the masses. That's a moral quest.
As I looked at sort of some of Van Gogh's self-portraits, I thought of somehow updating that into some sort of perverse information age equation that would somehow be able to locate the individual as a sort of object in my time in relationship to how he did it in relationship to his time. And so I thought of utilizing the consumables, you know, that we choose. Each one of us is defined through a series of choices prescribed by the culture, and we just select out of the myriad possibilities, whether it be, so for instance, I picked the Glamour toothpaste. But then again, this is rot gut mezcal, which you can essentially run a motorcycle on. Of course, we go upscale to channel 13 and down to Fruit of the Loom. So somehow in the sort of matrix of all this, we isolate the individual. So it became to me a sort of somehow as accurate as the Van Gogh one was for its time, but maybe not, but maybe.
You know, I really think art is always relevant to its time. You know, how it's relevant is difficult to judge in the present. But I mean, as an artist, I think that's what, you know, you do, absorb and synthesize the conditions that you surround yourself with and that you're surrounded by. You know, I really want my work to be about the present, to function in the present, you know, rather than sort of deal with sentiment and memory. I mean, these pieces are really about kind of taking off. You know, they're about the mass being dislocated from the ground. Well, I mean, you can't sit around and talk to somebody about that. I mean, unless they're basketball players or something.
Inevitably, the landscapes of April Gornik offer beyond their own rewards the haunting resonance of another age. Perhaps only in our time would an artist feel the need to declare the absence of irony.
My intention when I paint is not ironic. I'm not interested in showing the viewer that I know, that they know, that it's passé to paint landscapes, or that this landscape isn't really about being a landscape, it's really about being something else, and you think it looks beautiful, but I'm just kidding around. I'm not kidding around with the beauty of the work or the seriousness or anything like that. It's really personal work, it's really poetic work, it's really intimate work, it's really powerful work, and it's not about how we all know about work like that. It's about making work that is newly all of those things.
The endangered land and the sea and the city are very present in this year's biennial, in forms that reassure and then disturb. The history of art ebbs and flows within them and leaves its poignant traces everywhere.
I feel that I'm as much a contemporary of Velázquez as I am of Diebenkorn. As a painter, I can say that over the period of, the last 10 years or so, I've become increasingly more impatient with contemporary art. And I felt that there was no place for me to feed off of here. And so I started to turn back. It's called The Birth of Jan van Eyck and the extent of his influence on the art of painting for a period of 600 years, which conveniently would include me into this tradition, I was very taken by the early Flemish masters themselves, and I felt a great kinship with their sensibility of being able to show the whole world, from telescoping out to the farthest distances, as well as including you into the most intimate, close details.
A more dangerous school of fish fills a nearby room in the biennial. Chris Burden handmade and commissioned 625 model boats, representing all the submarines ever launched by this country. Their official names line the wall. Burden came to prominence in the late 60s and 70s with a series of performance sculptures, sometimes involving physical violence upon himself. Recent works, including one representing 50,000 Russian tanks, address a more universal danger.
It's a fine line, but I don't see how you could make art in this day and age and not and ignore, these issues that are. It looks like mankind is on a sort of a suicidal course. All information tells us that every day. So for art to ignore that seems dangerous to me, or a little bit like Nero, fiddling while the city burns or something.
Alan McCollum's individual works resemble toy-like projectile missiles or hand grenades, displayed with the panoramic overkill of an American supermarket. Each of the 10,000 unique plastic forms is made from combinations of elements cast from domestic objects like cat toys, drawer pulls, and bottle caps. In its comment on art as commodity, the aura of the handmade object has been supplanted by the aura of mass production. Elsewhere in the biennial, the aura of the handmade object glows as brightly as ever. The sculpture of St. Clair Semin draws historically from Art Nouveau and biographically from a Brazilian childhood in surroundings that were both Victorian and rustic.
I work with the notion of grotesque and beautiful and see how you can articulate those notions into one unity. I think the understanding of the origins and the understanding of the historical background of the work gives a certain sense of complicity between the viewer and the artist. But I think this sense of complicity and proximity to the work is as good as a sense of estrangement and alienation from the work. It's not necessarily the best thing, it's just one possibility. I give you an example. I saw a show recently and there was a whole explanation about the show, and the explanation made it more poor. Actually, the show was much more interesting when I was trying to figure it out myself.
An audience familiar with the deadpan humor of William Wegman's video and photography art may be surprised by his paintings, but not by his childhood.
Well, I was born on a tiny cot in southwestern Massachusetts during World War II, a sick and lonely child. I turned to photography early on to overcome my childhood isolation. My tiny hands could barely crank the Hasselblad, so my parents instead gave me watercolors as an easier medium for me. I was a very ambitious graduate student at the University of Illinois. Certainly painting was the last thing anyone was doing. In fact, if you did a painting, you would call it a wall piece. You wouldn't really call it a painting, or maybe you would put a painting on the floor and call it a floor piece, or a corner piece, or an outdoor piece, so it was part of the peace movement, and we were all doing pieces then and not painting. It's a B-52 bomber that seems to be either landing or taking off. We can't really quite tell. It's very ominous, and it's in the category of not so funny paintings. One is called Migratory Architecture, and it's got various architectural styles in one scene, from medieval Romanesque to Gothic and like early Bauhaus, I suppose. And flying out from the top left of the frame are 3 migratory geese.
People who look at the painting have an idea of what the World Trade Center is, and here's a painting called World Trade Center. What's interesting is how much is left out while you know exactly what it is. And I think people are interested in what's left out, and I think painters are interested in how you left it out. I used extremely big brushes and used extremely few marks, which was a trip to do. It's sort of like taking a high leap off something. When I was working on the painting, I was close up, so all that was in my field of vision was red. And it was a very powerful effect on the eyes. I could feel that seeing was expanding a little bit in some way. There was a lot of input on those optical nerves. Your life is defined in time. The way I relate to it is by thinking of infinity more. Religion connects with that, history, thinking about art in other times, using shapes that have been significant to people for thousands of years. Time is real important for me. One is, as a woman now, that's any woman you talk to, I think, will say that they're very, it was a big deal that the culture has changed, the society has changed the way it has. so that you can live alone and work alone and do what you want to do. It's a big deal. Often I think artists' reasons for doing things have as much to do with their art as with outside content. It's like the old idea, like for hundreds of years people painted a Madonna and Child, and the difference mainly was in how one artist did it from another. The idea didn't change radically for a long time, and how it was done was significant, and I think that that's what's most interesting about people's work, is how it was done.
At 51, one of the oldest and best-known artists in the show, Brice Marden paid moving allegiance to artists who inspired him.
When I just finished writing this thing about de Kooning, you know, like saying what an influence he was and how we as students and sort of learning painters, you know, really studied his exhibitions, you know. And, I mean, you just went over all the material about it and try and find about it. The more you could find out about him, the more you found out about how to make paintings, you know. Because he was sort of the guiding light. I mean, he was the living great. When you're younger, you're just really out there with the antennas, really willing to take in anything, any kind of stimulation. And I think I'm on to a different kind of focusing now than I was, say, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I've just come back from a trip, and I went through a couple of museums. The best thing I saw was a group of 6 Pollocks from the 52, 53. And I know that I'd seen all the paintings somewhere, sometime before. I mean, in the Pollock retrospective, this, that, and books, and but it was just a soaring kind of experience to just to look at them. And it's not looking at them, you're looking at them sort of figuring out what he did. But like the more you figure out what he does, the more you can concentrate on what isn't there, which is really what is so great. I mean, which is what the whole is about. And when I say what isn't there, what I mean by, like it's the thing that's beyond technique, it's beyond color, it's, or the applications or this or that.
Sherry Levine is a very important artist. She and Barbara Kruger really paved the way for other women in the art world. They did a lot of groundwork that allows me to be where I am. And I was pretty honored to be hung in the room with her. I was working as a bookkeeper in an art gallery, which is what I've been doing to support myself over the years. And one day while I was opening the mail, I started noticing the patterns on the insides of the envelopes, the bills that I would pay. And I was fascinated that these, abstract patterns were being used to conceal financial information, essentially. So I bumped them up on the Xerox machine and started to photograph them.
Across the gallery, from the almost invisible, embedded-in-the-wall rotating disc of Charles Ray, calmly spinning at a speed of 3,500 revolutions per minute, Hirsch Perlman challenges the viewer with his linguistic investigations of conceptual art.
It's not necessarily that important that somebody know about Wittgenstein's house, or that even Wittgenstein was a philosopher who dealt with a lot of these questions of language. They use architecture as almost a foil to get at questions of reading the text panels are sort of a pivotal point where you try and read that as a caption to images, but there's a kind of dislocation that happens, or lack of hierarchy, so that you don't know whether to caption, at some point you don't know whether to caption the text to the image or to the building itself, perhaps. And then, you know, it can start to call into question a whole lot of things. I'm not really interested in artwork where it's really easy to figure out what the artist's trying to tell you or what the intention is, because I'm not even quite sure all the time what my intentions are, and I'm very interested in sort of calling that whole that the question is how you arrive at meaning, and that the viewer has to take a lot of part in that.
The viewer takes a strong role in a work by Julia Scher, at a moment in history when TV surveillance was being used as a weapon of oppression in China. The artist provided security by Julia to the '89 biennial. Cameras placed at strategic locations fed information to a video printer. Visitors could take away a photo documentation of themselves as a product of our culture.
As a three-dimensional collage, I was interested in economics and how, you know, this thing functions, and being as important as it is. And so what I did for this particular piece was to take, you know, two extremes of the economic spectrum. One of them being Wall Street. This is one channel, and the other channel is but the guy is at the corner of Broadway and Houston. The guys that clean the windshields. So have, you know, two completely extreme examples of a free market society, if you will. I think it exemplifies very clearly, very concisely, you know, in what kind of, you know, economic territory we move.
The regular screening of works by artists in film and video within the biennial helps reveal concerns and issues that they share with painters and sculptors, and dramatizes their vanguard relationship to commercial film and TV. Artists like Woody Vasulka continue explorations begun long before the innovations of music video. Bends time and events to her fanciful purpose by making a new Old Russian film about Rasputin. In the biennial, screenings alternated with Anton's performance as her own creation, the celebrated ballerina Eleonora Antonova.
My films all during the 70s had to do with women's issues. Taboo subjects, subjects that hadn't been represented yet on the screen. Subjects such as menstruation, menopause, women's sexuality, ritual and play, aging. And this was a very content-oriented cinema. And as the feminist movement became incorporated into the society and was no longer apart from it, and more women and men began to make films that represented women, which I thought in a more realistic manner, I began to turn to another part of myself, which are an artist part that's concerned about time and space. And I began to make a cinema that was based on a frame-to-frame relationship. Endangered is a film that I began a year ago. Film is a very fragile medium, especially in electronic culture that we're in. It's a manipulated medium. In other words, I can handcraft it. It scratches easily. So I took the film itself. While I was at the MacDowell colony, I had a dream that I should endanger the film. And I went into the gardener's cottage and I got out scraping tools and scraped it. And I got Brillo pads and took Brillo around the images. The images are from the Galapagos Islands as well as myself, species that have been maybe separated and distinguished but are also endangered. I took the material of the film and ran it through a sewing machine. I took hydrochloric acid and etched out the blue-footed boobies and the seals. And then I rephotographed it with the optical printer so that every frame relates to the frame before it. And I like to use the printer as if it were part of my body, an extension. I used to be a painter. I was an expressionist painter.
In the words of the organizing curators, artists are struggling to develop a visual language which can cope with the demands of the present, while seeking values that will endure. Contemporary art, as accomplished and eerie as the civilization we have constructed, continues to sustain us with its vital, regenerative power.
You have to be tall and have an aquiline nose to be a really great painter.
Me and Joel Shapiro, we're not that old. We're like we're the old people in the show.
Am I allowed to make asides to the camera? You may edit a lot of this stuff out.
We try to show that we can be powerful. We can manipulate.
Now, okay, now just take out all the you-knows, the ahs.
I think I got that better earlier.